Good morning, everybody. Last time we were talking about some forms of anti-metaphysics, those who say that metaphysics is defective or hopeless in some way, and there were six anti-metaphysical viewpoints covered in the reading, and we got through more or less the first three, which were what? They're up there. Relativism, which says basically existence is relative to what we believe or to what the individual believes, and then there are a lot of problems with that. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, I posted some notes. Does everyone see? I posted lecture notes for that lecture, so I'm going to post some notes for today's lecture too, with some of the more technical equations and things that come up. And the second one was nihilism, which says that nothing exists at all, so there would be no subject matter for metaphysics to investigate. And thirdly, there was skepticism, which says that no knowledge of the existence of anything is possible. Actually, the originator of nihilism, Gorgias, the pre-Socratic philosopher, had said, actually in his famous essay, little essay on the topic, had put forward three propositions that he was going to defend. The first was that nothing exists. That was nihilism. Second one said that if something does exist, then it's totally unknowable. Right? So that would be skepticism. And then he had a third fallback, which was that if anything is knowable, it's not communicable. So the knower can't communicate what he knows to anybody else. That's a fairly bleak picture. Not really one that's compatible with the ideals of metaphysics, that we can profitably discuss the fundamental nature of reality, or the basic structure of reality. Before I start in then on anti-metaphysical views 4, 5, and 6, Kantianism, Wittgensteinianism, and positivism, I did want to ask if you had any further questions or thoughts about the first three before we go on, about relativism, nihilism, or skepticism. Yes? Pyrrhonian. Yeah. So the question was, what are the two categories of skepticism? And I said there's academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. The Pyrrhonians say that we shouldn't even believe anything, aside from maybe the immediate character of our mental states. We shouldn't have any beliefs about things that aren't directly and immediately obvious. If there are any things like that, we shouldn't have any beliefs about them. Whereas and if you can't have beliefs, you can't have knowledge, because knowledge requires belief. So, but they don't actually put forward a view. They don't say there is no knowledge, for example, because they would say we can't know that. They have no belief, right? They just don't believe anything.
Is it Pyrrho or
Pyrrho is how it's pronounced. Yeah, Pyrrho of Elis, Pyrrho. Yeah, he believes that's the route to inner tranquility, or ataraxia in the original Greek, is to don't shackle yourself with beliefs. They just get you into trouble and make you worry and fret. The academic skeptics are okay with having beliefs. They just deny that any knowledge, they hold the belief that no knowledge is possible, whereas the Pyrrhonians don't even believe that. The academics believe that no knowledge is possible, but it is possible to have probable opinions. Now, is it true that there's no knowledge? I mean, that's not something we should uncritically accept. There may be some things we can know, like that I exist, that 2 and 2 equals 4. Maybe we can even know that the sun will rise tomorrow. So that's an open question. But If you agree with the academic skeptics that probability is the guide to life and that no genuine knowledge is possible in any case, that wouldn't necessarily rule out the disciplines of science and metaphysics. One could base them on reasonable belief rather than knowledge. I mean, that would be giving up a lot. We want to say we can have knowledge. We want to say we can have scientific knowledge, I think. That would be nice, but, and likewise for metaphysics, but if metaphysics or natural science turn out to be limited in the kinds of knowledge they can actually establish, they could still move forward. Both of these kinds of fields, natural science or empirical science, and metaphysics could still move forward on an empirical or probabilistic basis. We could say, well, this metaphysical theory is better because it's a better explanation of the data, and therefore it's more likely or more probable than other metaphysical theories. And likewise for natural science. It is true that in both science and metaphysics, the theories that are held in one epoch are overthrown and replaced by new theories. So certainly we don't have to hold that we have conclusive proof of the truth of anything in either the sciences or in metaphysics. Okay, Kantianism. Immanuel Kant, 1711 to 1776. He considers the question of whether metaphysics is really possible, and his conclusion is that metaphysics isn't possible. And why is that? Well, he says we can really only have knowledge about our own thoughts about reality, but not about reality itself. So I'll repeat that. According to Kant, our knowledge is limited to our thoughts about reality. In other words, to our conceptual scheme, but we can never really know or render sufficiently probable any hypotheses about what reality in and of itself is like. Kant called that the thing in itself. So Kant distinguished between our conceptual framework, which is a thing in our minds, basically made out of our thought processes. He distinguished that from the world as it is in itself, which he called the thing in itself, or the Ding an sich, in German, the thing in itself. He said the thing in itself is unknowable, but we can know about our thoughts about reality. So philosophy has to confine itself to studying our thoughts about reality, but metaphysics in the traditional sense as something which examines what exists in reality is hopeless. We can never figure that out. There's a kind of, we're enclosed within our own veil of thoughts, and we can't penetrate through the appearances and get through to the ultimate reality that might or might not be behind them. His view, though, is kind of paradoxical because he did insist that there was a thing in itself, and then one could ask, well, how do you know that there even is a thing in itself, as opposed to thoughts about reality? Kant basically says that our thought about reality organizes the universe. First of all, there are two forms of mental intuition, which are space and time. So anything that we experience, he says, must fall. We can know in advance that it must fall within space or time because that's how our thought processes organize reality in terms of space and time. That's a mental thing. So space and time are mind-dependent. Though he says there is a world out there behind that, but we can't know what it is. But then how do we know that it even exists, right? He doesn't really give a satisfactory answer for that. He also says that we use categories. So we have these two forms of intuition or representational perception, space and time. Everything will be presented within a space-time network or framework. We also have certain categories which, given human nature, given our minds, we're going to use. For example, the category of substance and the category of cause and effect. He says these are categories that exist in our mind and that we will apply to the things in space and time. So it says we can study all that stuff. We shouldn't confuse that with actual metaphysics. It's really a kind of super psychology. It's studying this mental framework that we have that organizes the world. And the reason we can say that everything will be in space and time and that everything is made of substances and that everything has a cause that produces it and so on. The reason we can say that is that that's just because the way our mind processes things. But we can't really say that reality in itself is like that. We have no idea what that's like. It's impossible to know. A good response to this, I think, is that this view is kind of self-incoherent or at odds with itself, self-contradictory. The problem is that if we can have knowledge of our thoughts about reality, then mustn't those thoughts themselves have some ontological status as beings? That is, our thoughts must exist. These forms of intuition must exist. These categories must exist. Our minds must exist. And they would turn out to be things in themselves, wouldn't they? It seems, on this view. So Kantianism contradicts itself in saying that we can have no knowledge of things in themselves. It seems to entail that our thoughts are real things. So an objection to Kantianism. In other words, Kantianism collapsed into idealism. Just the view that reality is a mental thing, but there is a reality, it's just mental. Right? So Kant would then be really an idealist in disguise, right? Which is a perfectly respectable traditional metaphysical view, that there is no material world, reality is made up of minds and their thoughts. Fine. We may or may not agree with that, but we'd be back on the grounds of metaphysics, again, which he said we can't do. That's the problem there. Moving on to Wittgensteinianism. Wittgenstein is an early 20th century philosopher. Is extremely influential. He was born in 1889 and passed away in 1951. He tried to resolve the problem of metaphysics in terms of language. So you might say that Wittgenstein is a proponent of linguisticism. He says that what we call metaphysical problems are really symptoms of linguistic confusions that we have, confusions in our language, and that we can resolve or clarify these issues and make them go away by studying and clarifying the way we use words. So the problems of metaphysics aren't really about what exists in the world, they're really problems that need to be resolved by showing that we misunderstand our own language. And that if we clarify that, the metaphysical problems would go away altogether.
So there's no problem.
There's no problem. Yeah, and the fact that we misconstrue our own linguistic usage. He compares it to a fly trapped in a bottle. And the way to solve the problem is to take the cork out of the bottle, and the fly can get out. The metaphysician, though, the traditional metaphysician may respond to this that how we use language is not really the salient issue. It's how we ought to use language or how we should use it. I mean, you can imagine people using language in all kinds of ways, either very well and insightfully or in a very confused way or whatever. But the issue seems to be not how we in fact use it, but how it ought to be used. And that seems to raise questions about whether our language corresponds with what exists, to what extent our language corresponds to what exists, which would then re-raise the questions of metaphysics. One example might be that naively, in our ordinary language, we described objects like this book as having a certain color. We say the book is red. So the metaphysical question would be, is that how we should use language? There's no dispute about the fact that we do describe books as being literally red. According to a mechanistic scientific viewpoint, though, books don't literally have redness. They just cause us to perceive them as having these colors under certain conditions. Now, I'm not saying that view is correct or not, but if it is correct, then we ought to correct our ordinary usage and say the book isn't really as it appears to be. It may appear red to us, but it may appear a totally different color, say, to a different animal. And it's all a matter of the physiology of sense perception and the brain. Then science and metaphysics would be correcting ordinary usage. So the fundamental issue is how should we use our language, not how do we use it. And that in turn raises questions of whether our language corresponds to reality, which are involve an element of traditional metaphysical inquiry.
You said this is similar to nihilism in that the idea that there's something noble cannot be communicated and escape from or is that something?
I think it may. I mean, it has something. All these forms of anti-metaphysics have something in common. So yeah. I think it actually may have a little more in common with relativism because it's sort of saying there are different linguistic practices and games, which say different tribes could have different languages. If it's really all about resolving linguistic confusions, then what's to prevent different languages from having different beliefs about reality? And then internally within their own belief systems or language games, as Wittgenstein called them, they'd be perfectly entitled to practice those language games. And all they'd have to do is just get clear on how they use their own language in their games. There wouldn't be any further question about what really existed or whether their language, their use of terms in their language game corresponded to reality or not. So I think it's got a lot in common with a kind of relativism. If you read the later Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations. Actually, the earlier Wittgenstein, when he was a young man, around the time of World War I, he wrote a book with a very different character called the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, which was extremely metaphysical, but at the very end said that the whole book itself was nonsensical. He said, this book is just a ladder, and once you climb up it, you can toss it away. At that point, Wittgenstein was a proponent of our last anti-metaphysical view, which number 6 there is positivism. But he was advocating in his earlier days for a specific type of positivism, known as logical positivism, but logical positivism is not the only type of positivism. So in general, positivism says that science is the guide of life, that all knowledge comes from the sciences, the empirical sciences in particular, and perhaps also logic and mathematics. So I'll repeat that. According to positivism, there are no metaphysical insights because all the insights that are to be had must come from the sciences. Okay, so then the question is, what sciences are we going to recognize? Generally, positivists all agree that we should accept the empirical sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. There may be additional sciences, right? Geology, psychology, and so on. It's a question how far you want to go, right? Should we include sociology, anthropology, and so on? But there's broad agreement, at least on the fundamental sciences, that they should be accepted. Then there are the so-called a priori sciences, and this is where things get a little tricky within positivism. Those are logic and mathematics. So logic is a study of the correct forms of reasoning, and it's closely related to the mathematical sciences, which also may include things like set theory. But you all know what mathematics is, right? You've studied that, like 1 and 1 equals 2, and more advanced forms like calculus, and geometry, and topology, and so on. Now, some positivists, like John Stuart Mill, who was a 19th century British philosopher, he was a positivist, and he actually went so far as to hold that logic and mathematics are themselves empirical sciences. And not known through a priori reasoning or thought. So what I mean is, according to Mill, the principles of logic and mathematics are laws about how human beings think. So they're scientific laws of human psychology, according to Mill. So human beings will think that if they add 1 and 1, they'll get 2, right? So, and every human being always thinks that, so it's a psychological law that 1 and 1 equals 2. It's not something that we know independently of experience. And the same is true for logic. Mill believes that logical laws are also empirical generalizations about how we think. And this view is known as psychologism, about logic and math. It's a highly problematic view. For one thing, we don't seem to be able to empirically disconfirm laws of logic and mathematics. I mean, it's hard to even it seems impossible to conceive or imagine of a universe where we would reject 1 and 1 equals 2. Because when we saw one thing and then counted them up, we found 3 things. We wouldn't think that 1 and 1 equals 3. We would just think that somehow a third object was getting snuck in there, right? It seems like we'd still reach the conclusion, no matter what, that 1 and 1 is 2. Because we know this just through the basic concept that the union of a set of 1 and another set of 1 is a set that has 2 elements. So it's hard to see how we could think that. The other problem is that human beings, in fact, aren't totally rational, and that if you actually look at the thought processes of humans, they're often irrational. So then how do we come up with the laws of logic by studying the laws of human psychology if humans are often illogical? We're not all like Mr. Spock on Star Trek, who's all, right? We often ourselves reason illogically, so it doesn't seem like the laws of human thought would correspond to the laws of logic that we have. So another branch of positivism arose. Most positivists rejected this view, that all sciences are empirical. And the form of positivism that rejects that is known as logical positivism, and Wittgenstein, in his early days, was a logical positivist. Logical positivists say that for a statement or sentence to have meaning, cognitive significance, that is, to have a truth value of either true or false, it must either be an analytic statement or sentence, and by that is meant a statement or sentence which is itself either a tautology or a contradiction, or reducible to a tautology or a contradiction. In other words, a logically true or a logically false proposition. They allow these as having cognitive significance or truth value. Analytic propositions. So examples of analytic propositions are either it is raining or not. That would be an analytically true proposition because it's a necessary logical truth that either it is raining or not. Then you can have analytically false propositions. These are contradictory, self-contradictory. An example would be, it is both raining and not. That one's impossible. So positivists say that the first one, that either it's raining or not, is logically true, and the impossible one, that it is both raining and not, is logically false. So they have truth values. Anything with a truth value has cognitive meaning or significance. Of course, if it's impossible, we don't care that much about it, right? And it couldn't be an object of scientific knowledge or anything like that. So we're mainly interested in the ones that are logically true. Analytic propositions also include a further group, which are things that are statements that are reducible to logical tautologies or contradictions. An example would be a television set is a TV. We talked about that last time. Or a vixen is a fox. A vixen as a fox is reducible to a logical truth because the word vixen is simply shorthand for female fox. So when you say a vixen is a fox, you're just saying a female fox is a fox. And a female fox is a fox is a tautology, a logically true proposition. Or on the other hand, you could make it a contradictory analytic truth, like a vixen is not female, which would be reduced to something that's self-contradictory. Namely, a female fox is not female, which would be self-contradictory and therefore false. Okay, so those are all meaningful according to logical positivists. They have cognitive significance. The other group of propositions which are meaningful are those that are propositions of natural science, or empirical science, I should say. So, logical positivists say that any statement that has a truth value, and in that sense is meaningful or not nonsensical gibberish, is going to either be analytic or be empirically verifiable. Propositions of metaphysics, they claim, fall outside of this group and therefore are without any cognitive significance. They're neither true nor false. Not just propositions of metaphysics. Lots of other propositions turn out to lack cognitive significance too for logical positivists, including propositions of ethics and aesthetics and so on. So the only ones that really make any sense are the propositions of logic and math. Mathematical propositions only make sense because they can be reduced to propositions of logic. and statements of empirical science they're willing to accept. So that's kind of the logical positivist viewpoint. So they regarded other propositions that lack cognitive significance as potentially having some kind of other meaning, a meaning which does not correlate to any kind of truth value, which include emotional meanings. So propositions could have emotive meanings for them. They could express a feeling or emotion, for example. So if you say killing is evil, that could express a negative attitude that you have towards killing. Or if you say that keeping your promises is right, that could express a positive attitude that you have towards keeping promises. Or it could express a command or prescription, like always tell the truth or always keep your promises. So a prescription or command, like the 10 Commandments, these would also lack truth values. If you put an exclamation point after a sentence and say, don't kill, exclamation point, that won't have a truth value. It'll just express a negative attitude toward killing, or a positive attitude towards keeping your promises or honoring your mom and dad or whatever the prescription is. So logical positivists didn't deny all meaning to non-scientific statements, but they denied that they had cognitive meaning, the kind of meaning that's associated with a truth value. Any question or about that? It's a bit of a subtle point. So they recognize two types of meaning. So one famous logical positivist said that metaphysical propositions could express kinds of personality traits. He said those who put forward a materialist metaphysics, who say that the world is composed of material particles, for example, these people were expressing their extroverted personality, their outward-looking personality. Whereas idealists who said that everything is spiritual were expressing their introverted personalities. But these were not propositions in either case that had a truth value, because they were not either analytic propositions or propositions that could be empirically verified. The problem came for the positivists with actually making clear what they meant by empirically verifiable propositions, however. As I'm going to show, it turned out that they could never clarify this idea, so never really make good on their anti-metaphysical thesis that only the propositions of logic and empirical science are worth studying, and that metaphysics is all emotional nonsense that doesn't correlate to any truth values. Part of the motivation for this, by the way, was a reaction to the extreme metaphysical views of German idealism in the late 19th century. Kant's views had led to extreme idealism among German philosophers. Some of these views influenced English philosophers. So after Kant basically came Hegel. Hegel was a very obscure writer. He rejected the traditional laws of logic. So logically minded and scientifically minded philosophers were very much in opposition to Hegelian philosophy and wanted a class that all is a lot of nonsense. And Hegel did influence a number of philosophers, even in England, where logical empiricism had a lot of followers. There were Hegelians in England as well. Bradley, McTaggart, and Green were the three main British idealists during this period. So there was a lot of hostility to that among the more scientifically and mathematically minded and logically minded philosophers. They just wanted to reject Hegel's very obscure and dense and often illogical philosophical writings, and say that we should avoid this and just stick to logic and math and science, and we'd be a lot better off. It was a reaction to the excesses of German idealism. Because Hegel did not accept Kant's view. Hegel actually raised the same kind of criticism that I raised earlier. He said, look, the thing in itself is nonsense. Why should we have a thing in itself? Why shouldn't we just be idealists who say that only the mind exists on this kind of view? Okay, so how did the logical positivists proceed? Well, they came up with what they called the verification criterion of cognitive meaning or significance. They tried to come up with a rule that would tell you when a statement was acceptable as having genuine meaning and when it wasn't. And this was called the verification criterion of meaning, or the verifiability criterion. It basically said a proposition has empirical meaning if and only if it's empirically verifiable. Has empirical meaning. A proposition has cognitive significance if and only if it's either analytic or empirically verifiable. Right? If we want to include the statements of logic and mathematics as well, which they did. Let's just call it the verification criterion of meaning. Well, we should really say cognitive significance. So this says, the first version of this was that, what we're going to see is that none of the versions ever could work, which was an enormous embarrassment and meant that the whole objection to metaphysics kind of collapses if you can't come up with a criterion of a cognitively significant scientific statement, right? Because then you have no way of distinguishing. So a statement S has cognitive significance if and only if either by the way, I'm going to have all this in the lecture notes that I post, so you don't really have to get writer's cramp here. Either S is analytic, so that's going to include logical truths and mathematical truths, right? All of these can be reduced to tautological expressions like A is equal to A, and either it is either P or not P, and stuff like that. Either it's analytic, and this could include analytic falsehoods too, because according to them they would be false, and therefore like a round square exists would be meaningful according to this theory because it's impossible, which makes it false. So it has meaning, but it has a impossible false truth value. So it's pretty insignificant, but it still has meaning. So analytic sentences or statements include all logical truths, things that are necessarily true by their logical form, like all female foxes are foxes. All female foxes are female, things like that. And their negations. Because if something has cognitive significance, its negation must have cognitive significance. Right? So either it's analytic or two, And here was the empiric, right, or it's empirically verifiable. That was the real meat of this, to come up with the, right, because everybody could agree that logic and math made sense, right? So the trick was, where's the border, and clearly metaphysics wasn't part of logic or math, right? So clearly metaphysics was more like science, right? In like putting forward propositions about what exists in the world. And they felt that that fell only within the purview of scientific investigation, and the metaphysics was completely wrong-headed, and in fact, nonsensical in a way, as not having any truth value. Metaphysical sentences had no truth value. They might express feelings or personality traits or whatever, but they had no truth value. So they had to define empirical verifiability of a statement S. So what is it for S to be empirically verifiable? Well, what they said was that S is logically entailed by some finite, consistent set of observation sentences. Well, I'll say observation statements. And here's our set. Observation statement 01, 02, 03, ... ON. So what they're basically saying is that a statement is empirically verifiable or has empirical meaning, aside from the logical cases covered by Clause 1, if that statement is logically entailed by some finite, consistent set of statements expressing your observations. So, for example, take a statement like a dog is brown. Okay. Would this have empirical meaning? Yes, because it's logically entailed by some set of observation sentences. Like, suppose you're looking at Rover and you say, this thing in front of me is brown because I observed that. Okay. If I say this is brown and that's an observation, this is brown and this is a dog, right? Both of which are observations that I make, would entail that a dog is brown, right? So that's the idea. So a statement like a dog is brown would have empirical meaning because it's entailed by some set of observations that you can make, right? So therefore it's meaningful. On the other hand, if you say that the universe is entirely composed of spiritual beings, right? How would you empirically verify that if you make a metaphysical statement, right? Or if you say the world is entirely made of material beings, how would you empirically verify that, right? You couldn't, not by any finite set of observation sentences. So they felt like through this criterion they were letting in the statements as meaningful that they would need, like a dog is brown, while excluding the grandiose metaphysical pronouncements of Hegel and other metaphysicians who said that everything in the universe is material or spiritual, or that there are both material and spiritual things, like Descartes held, right, and so on and so forth. So they're getting rid of metaphysics as not having any empirical meaning, while letting in something like a dog is brown. All you'd have to do is observe that it's brown and a dog, right? And maybe you could break dog up into other predicates, right, like four-legged and furry and so on. And you could observe all of those things. All right, so the first problem with this is that in ruling out they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. Yeah, they could throw out that everything in the universe is spiritual or material or whatever, but they're also ruling out any universal generalization becomes meaningless on this theory. A universal generalization is a proposition of the form all A's are B's. Okay? There are some universal generalizations that are basic laws of science. What would be an example? Anybody? Can you think of a universal law? Newton had 3. Sir Isaac Newton had 3 laws. Yeah, gravity, right? The law of gravity. What does that say? Basically that all bodies mutually attract. Any pair of bodies attract each other. Okay? How are you going to, so if that's S, right? If S is all pairs of bodies attract, how is that logically entailed by some finite, consistent set of observation sentences? Well, you could observe that these 2 bodies attract, right? And you could observe that then this pair and that pair and that pair. Does that get you to all bodies attract? No. Why? Because you could still find the possibility is still there that you might observe some pair, somebody someday might observe some pair that doesn't attract. Right? Like some weird particles, like antimatter or something, right? Or whatever, right? Still possible that could be discovered. So therefore, all bodies attract is not entailed by any finite, consistent set of observation sentences, right? Therefore, all bodies attract is cognitively meaningless. Therefore, the basic laws of our scientific theories are meaningless. So it looks like logical positivism becomes incoherent. Right? Their whole thing was the worship of the worship of science, but the idea that science is the be and end all of human knowledge isn't going to work because it crucially relies on universal generalizations known as scientific laws to do its thing. And the positivists, by this criterion, are excluding some of the very statements that they want to be meaningful. So it's too strict. At the same time, it's also too broad, as I'll now show. It also lets in things that would be clearly nonsensical, according to a positivist. They still get in, as well as excluding things that you don't want to exclude if you're a positivist. Any question before I proceed to that? Okay, so it's a law of basic logic. Well, that if a statement is logically entailed by some other statement, that the disjunction of the entailed statement with any other statement is also logically entailed by that same body of statements. This has to do with the truth table or truth conditions for disjunction. A disjunction is when you say S or S prime or P or Q or whatever. And the truth table for or says that P or Q is true if and only if either P or Q or both are true. The only circumstance when P or Q is going to be false is when both are false. So if a proposition P is entailed by some stuff, then that same stuff entails P or anything else that you care to add on. Because once it entails P, what you're being told is that if all these statements are true, then P will be true, which also means then that P or whatever you like will be true. And you could add on anything you want. So if it's meaningful that Rover is brown, right, which we agreed, then it's also meaningful by this that Rover is brown or the absolute is lazy. So you can put that on there. It's this metaphysical thing, the absolute. Which is clearly Hegelian metaphysical nonsense, right? That the absolute is lazy, right? Not empirically verifiable. But it is according to this because you can just add it on by that logical law. So the logical positivists are hoisted on their own petard here again, right? And now the problem is that the thing is too broad. It's too liberal. Not only, so it's both too restrictive in ruling out universal generalizations and too permissive in letting in Rover is brown or the absolute is lazy. Because if S is entailed by some observation sentences, then S or anything you like is entailed by that same set of observation sentences, given the very rules of logic and the truth tables for or. So they get a big problem. So they said, we got to throw this out and try something different. Okay, so some people said, well, really what's crucial is not verifiability, but falsifiability. The ability to disprove something by empirical observation is what we should be focusing on. And that was known as the falsifiability criterion of cognitive significance. So it says something has empirical meaning when it's possible to empirically falsify it. That makes sense? So what would the change be that we could make here? It's really simple. To change this from verifiability to falsify. It involves just a tiny little change in number 2. How do we do it? Instead of saying S is entailed, we would say what? Instead of saying S, we just have to put a little symbol in front of S, which is the negation sign. So to make it a falsifiability criterion, we just have to say that it's false that S is logically entailed by a finite, consistent set of observation sentences. Then we get a falsification criterion of cognitive significance. So we just change S to it is false that S. We just put this little squiggle here, which in logic means it is false that. So the negation of S. So now we can say that the law of gravity is meaningful. That's the beauty of this. Why? Because all you would need is one observation of two bodies that don't attract, and then you would have falsified that all bodies attract, right? And you wouldn't need an infinite number of observations, right? The trouble with the way it was before was you'd need an infinite number of observations to empirically verify that all bodies attract each other, which you can't have. But now to falsify it, you just need one observation. So now it'll become meaningful that all bodies attract each other and that force is always equal to mass times acceleration, whatever. Right? For every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Those will all become meaningful now because you could falsify them by one contrary observation. Of course, we don't ever make that observation because the laws are true. But in principle, we could, right? Or if somebody said all crows are black, okay? Would that be meaningful? Yes, because we can falsify it by the observation of a single albino crow, right? Which would in fact occur through a genetic mutation, right? So on the original one, the verification criterion, all crows are black, would have been meaningless because it could never be conclusively verified. but it'll become meaningful here because it can be conclusively falsified by observing just one white crow. Okay? So, however, now you just get a complementary problem. Whereas on the verification criterion, universal generalizations were meaningless. This one leads to existential generalizations being meaningless. So you're just trading one problem for another. What's an existential generalization? That says that there exists an X such that X is F for some predicate F. Suppose you say, so the existential quantifier in ordinary language is expressed using the word some, S-O-M-E. So suppose you say, some cow is red. Okay? Now, that'll be, looks like that should be meaningful, right? At some cows, right? It's certainly empirically verifiable, right? In principle, by finding a red cow, like a red heifer, right? If you could find one. Right? Whether you do or not, who knows, right? You may or you may not. There could be a mutation, right? Whatever. Right? All right, so that should be meaningful, but it's going to turn out to be meaningless. It's not going to satisfy two. It's not analytic, obviously, not a law of logic or anything. What's its negation? The negation of some cow is red is going to be a universal proposition. That's the problem. The negation of it is going to be what? That no cow is red, right? Which says that everything in the universe that's a cow is non-red, right? So it says basically that all cows are non-red. But all cows are non-red is one of those universal things, which can never be logically entailed by any finite set of observation sentences. Because you'd have to observe infinitely many cows and verify that there were all other colors like purple and yellow and green and whatever, but never red, right? So we have the same problem again. So once you negate this, which is what you have to do, because if this is S, it's S's negation that has to be entailed by a finite set of observation sentences. S's negation is going to be all cows are non-red, which is never logically entailed by any finite set of observation sentences because it's a universal generalization. So therefore now some cow is red is meaningless. So it's too restrictive. So then some genius said, well, what we really need to do is combine these two, say that it's either verifiable or falsifiable. Oh, yeah, before I get to that, I should also point out that this one also has that other problem of being too liberal and letting in metaphysical nonsense. Why? Because it's a law of logic that if the negation of a proposition is entailed by something, right, then the conjunction, right, of that statement with anything whatsoever, the negation of the conjunction of that proposition with anything whatsoever is also entailed. So if not S is entailed, then it's false that S and S prime for any S prime is entailed too, right? Because the rules for conjunction tell you that a conjunction is true if and only if both conjuncts are true. But one of the conjuncts we already know is false, right? It's entailed that it be false according to the formula. So once that's false, it's also going to have to be entailed that it's false that S and anything else you want to add on is false because S is already false. So therefore, S and anything you want to add on is false. So we could add on what? Our old friend, the absolute is lazy. So now it's going to turn out that, say, all crows are black and the absolute is lazy will turn out to be meaningful. See, because the negation of this will be logically entailed by finite consistent set. Why is that? Because given the observation of an albino crow, right, the first part of this will be entailed to be false, right, by some observation sentence, that they're all black by observing one white one, right? And then also it'll be false that all crows are black and the absolute is lazy, right? Because if one of them's false, the whole thing's false. A conjunction must be true all the way through. P and Q must both be true. So if once we know P is false, we can add on anything we want, and the conjunction of that with our original statement will be false too. So now again we have the Hegelian nonsense coming back in as meaningful once again. This time though it's a conjunction rather than a disjunction. In the first case it was, right, the dog is brown or the absolute is lazy, right? Now it's say all crows are black and the absolute is lazy. Turns out to be meaningful. So then they said, well, we need to combine verification and falsification and say that a statement is meaningful if and only if it's either analytic or empirically verifiable or empirically falsifiable. So that'll allow us to say that all crows are black is meaningful because it's falsifiable. And that some dog is brown is meaningful because it's verifiable by observing one brown dog. But we couldn't do that on the falsification criterion because it's not falsifiable that some dog is brown, right? Even if you search through like every dog and don't find any brown ones, there could always be more, like with the red cow. Right? Same thing. Even if we've searched 1 billion cows and haven't found a red one, right, we still don't know that there might be one lurking somewhere. So those problems are dealt with, but there's a third class where you combine quantifiers. They're called mixed quantifications. And they're neither empirically verifiable nor empirically falsifiable. For example, for every metal there is a solvent. Every metal has a solvent which will dissolve the metal. That will neither be verifiable nor falsifiable because it combines the two types of quantification together. So even if you have both, that it's either it's falsifiable or verifiable. Every metal has a solvent. Turns out to be neither of these, so it turns out meaningless, so it's too strict. So the positivists basically could never come up with a criterion that actually gave the results that they wanted. So that was pretty embarrassing. So that greatly weakened their case against metaphysics being meaningful. Unless you could come up with some kind of criterion. And there was an additional problem that affected all of these, which was the problem of self-referential incoherence, as it's known. See, the problem is that the verification criterion is itself a statement, right? It's a statement that a statement has cognitive significance if and only if certain conditions are met, either it's analytic or verifiable or falsifiable or whatever. So take that statement, which is the verification criterion. Being a statement, it falls under its own scope. So it will be cognitively significant if and only if it meets the conditions that it itself puts forward for meaningfulness. But does it? Is it an analytic truth of logic or mathematics, this criterion? No, right? It's not a mathematical or logical principle that a statement is meaningful if and only if it's empirically verifiable. Analytic, doesn't seem to be anyway, right? Is it empirically verifiable? No. How could you empirically verify or falsify, right? That a statement has meaning if and only if it meets these conditions. So it seems like by its own lights, right, by applying the principle to itself, it turns out to be itself meaningless, to lack cognitive significance. So it looks like the verification principle implies that it itself is meaningless, and hence we should reject it. It refutes itself. So this is known as the problem of self-referential incoherence. The verification criterion is incoherent because when you apply it to itself, it doesn't measure up to its own standard. So you might say what's been shown here is that logical positivism is itself, or the verification criterion anyway, a unsuccessful attempt to do metaphysics, since it turned out to be incoherent. But it doesn't itself seem to be either an analytic proposition or something that's empirically verifiable, so that seems to put it in the realm of metaphysics. It's just bad metaphysics because it's self-contradictory, undermines itself. Some positivists tried to get around this by claiming that it was an analytic truth. That seemed to be the only route they could take. That it's true by definition, that by the definition of meaning, that a proposition has meaning if and only if it's either analytic or. So then they would say it has cognitive significance in virtue of being analytic, even though it obviously can't be dealt with in terms of empirical verification or falsification. They claimed it was analytic. However, this seems to sort of trivialize the debate then. I mean, if you claim that the word meaning simply means this, then other people can claim that that's not what the word meaning means for them. It seems to come down to a irresolvable difference in what you think the meaning of meaning is for you. I mean, if they say that's what meaning means, somebody else could say, no, I have a broader conception of meaning. And that propositions, in the ordinary sense, statements or propositions of metaphysics and ethics and aesthetics, like a sunset is beautiful or whatever, murder is wrong, the world consists of material objects, whatever. That in the ordinary sense of meaning, these are perfectly meaningful statements that have a truth value of either true or false. If we try just, it seems like you're just legislating by fiat. If you say that the word meaning itself already settles the issue. But anyway, that would seem the best way out of that objection for the positivist, to claim that somehow it's analytically true. Even given that, though, they still haven't come up with a form of the theory that actually isn't either too restrictive or too liberal or both for their purposes. So. And finally, positivists sort of gave up. They could never come up with anything that would actually work. So in the end, they had a say uncle. And people began doing metaphysics again. Yeah, positivism reigned for about 20 years or 25 years, and then people began doing metaphysics again. Because they could never substantiate this, their criterion of cognitive significance in an adequate way. All right, so the remaining few minutes we have here, I'm going to start to talk about categories. That was the next topic. Uh, one of the things that metaphysics deals with is ontological categories. Ontological categories are kinds or classifications of beings that are highly general. They're among the more general categories of being. I gave some examples, I think, on the first day, like substance, event, property, boundary, space, a place, time, number, things of this sort. These are examples of ontological categories. One use for ontological categories is to come up with a taxonomy, that is a system of classification that classifies everything that there is in the world. Of course, there's a lot of disagreement about what exists in the world. So you could view these ontological taxonomies in two different kinds of ways at least. One project would be to come up with a system of categories that applies to everything that exists in reality and to nothing else. So to come up with that system, you'd have to answer the question of, at the basic level, what are the constituents that make up the universe? Okay. One might take a less committal view of the matter, though, and say, well, it's a big project to figure out definitively or to a decent probability, given the state of our current knowledge and background information, what the basic constituents of the universe are. So we might view the project as one of classifying all the possible kinds of beings there could be, rather than trying to figure out the actual beings. So there's, say, a dispute, say, between Hobbes and Descartes. Like Hobbes said that the universe is composed of particles or corpuscular entities, right? Material substances. Descartes said that in addition to material substances, there are also souls, which form a different category. Okay. So on the first approach, we'd have to resolve that dispute before we could come up with our system of classification. Right? On the second approach, we might say, well, you know, we're not sure whether the world is made up of bodies and souls, or maybe just souls, if you're an idealist like George Berkeley or Hegel. So now we've got three views, right? Just bodies and souls, or just souls. Without resolving that dispute, we might be able to agree that all of these different metaphysical frameworks or theories are at least possibly true, so that it's possible that there are souls, it's possible there are bodies, it's possible there are both, and so on. Right? So our system of ontological classification might just look at the possible kinds of beings. And we might leave the further question of coming up with the system of classification for the actual ultimate constituents of reality to a later date. It would obviously, all the entities included in such a final determination would be included in the broader classification of the different possible candidates for constituents of reality. So next time we'll have a look at some systems that of ontological classification or taxonomy that try to lay out a system of classification that captures different possible kinds of beings that may exist in terms of their ontological categories, their more general kinds or classifications of beings. So we'll have a look at that at the beginning of next class.